Dad always told me science was about finding truth, but the truth I found almost destroyed me. When I was 9, he went missing after a late night experiment. Everyone said he left us, but last winter, when a storm blew down trees behind our new property, I saw something white tangled in the branches. A lab coat, with his name still legible. I was 30 when we moved back to Alder Creek, the small New England town where I grew up. My husband, even tempered and patient, said it might be good for me to be closer to Mom, to the streets where my father once walked me to school. The house we bought was older than both of us, the kind of place where nails had bitten into the wood so deeply they'd forgotten they were foreign. Behind it were 5 scrappy acres of half-wild woods, maples, birches, a tangle of thorn bushes, and 2 narrow footpaths that stitched into state land. I work remote now, bookkeeping for a contractor across the river. It's quiet work. Numbers line up nicely, or they don't. People don't. On bad days, I scroll my phone, looking at the last photo I have of my dad, a selfie taken at his lab bench a week before he vanished in 2008. Sunlight flares against the dirty lab window, haloing his head. He never did selfies. Someone must have told him how to flip the camera because he's off-center, smiling with that crooked gentleness that made people trust him. He looks like he just made a pun. I remember his voice. You can't argue with data, kiddo. You can. People did. After he disappeared, folks whispered that he'd run to escape the fallout from a failing grant at the university's environmental chemistry lab. Others whispered something worse, that he'd had a second life. Mom never said that out loud, but I saw the questions eating at her. She kept his lab mug in our kitchen cabinet for years, then quietly moved it to a box. I learned to live in the crack where love and doubt rub each other raw. Then the nor'easter hit last December. It knocked out power for 3 days and laid 2 maples down, like corpses along the back of our property. Once the wind had blown itself out, I pulled on boots to survey the mess. Branches were speared into the ground, mud slick as clay. That's when I saw it. Something white snagged 6 feet up in a split branch, flapping like a surrender flag. I almost walked past, assuming it was somebody's torn tarp, but the fabric looked thick, not plastic. And as I waded closer, my knees trembled. It was a lab coat, yellowed, stiff with age, sleeves twisting in the breeze. I stood under it with both hands on the trunk, feeling suddenly 9 again, my shoes slipping on the linoleum. As I ran to the door the night the police came, there was a stain at the edge of the collar, rust or coffee, and an embroidered name over the pocket. Dr. Evan Hart, my father. I froze so long my hands went numb. Then I took off my scarf, looped it over the branch, and pulled the coat down slowly. There was weight in the pocket. My mouth dried out. I reached inside. It was a hotel laundry tag threaded to a tiny key, the old brass kind you'd see on file cabinets. The tag had the number 12 stamped into it, and on the edge of the paper, 2 letters written in my father's slanted block print, S.E. I didn't scream. I didn't run to the house. I laid the coat over a fallen branch, smoothed the fabric with shaking hands, and stared into the trees. It was early afternoon, but the woods felt dusky, watchful. I swallowed down the rush of nausea and pulled out my phone. I called the sheriff's office, then called Mom. She cried without sound, like the tears were escaping around some dam she'd been building for years. Sheriff Mason, broad-shouldered, late 40s, kind eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, arrived an hour later with a young deputy. He listened as I told him about Dad's disappearance, about the coat, about the key. He took photos, bagged the coat with gloved hands, and promised they'd dust it, test it, treat it like what it was, evidence. 17 years, he said softly, looking out into the trees. Storms uncover what people meant to keep buried. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay with the lamp on, listening to the storm gutters hiss, replaying every memory of 2008. The last dinner we'd had as a family, the way Dad had kissed the top of my head before going back to the lab. The ringing phone, the way Mom fumbled the receiver and then stood very straight, the color draining from her face. How people looked at me at school the next day. I wanted to believe that finding the coat meant we were closer to truth. But I'd learned the hard way that clues don't heal. They open more doors, the kind with hinges that squeal and hallways that narrow. The next morning, Sheriff Mason called. We're going to walk the woods behind your property, he said. We'll start at the downed trees. Can you meet us? I went out with him, the deputy, and an older volunteer who knew every deer path for miles. We moved slow, fanning out, stopping when the sheriff raised a hand. Within an hour, the deer path dipped into a shallow gully. Beyond it, half hidden by scrub, stood a shape I first mistook for a shadow. Then my eyes focused. A small shed, weathered wood, and a sheet metal roof. 20 yards further, another. It was like the skeletons of cheap storage units dropped into the forest and left to rot. The sheriff said my name carefully, as if reminding me to breathe. We approached the first shed. Its door hung open. Inside, the light was dim, greened by the canopy. Shelves lined the walls. Glass beakers, many clouded with mildew, stood like an audience. A thick chemical smell hung in the stale air, ethanol and something bitter. On a workbench sat a Polaroid photograph under a cracked plastic cover. I picked it up with gloved fingers the sheriff handed me. The picture bled a little, the old chemicals smudging time, but the face was clear. My father, he was thinner than in the selfie. His hair looked unwashed. His eyes were staring directly into the camera with a tired, stubborn defiance I knew from every time he refused to sign a field trip form without reading every line. The deputy whispered, "Oh, man." There were more sheds, 5 in total in a loose semicircle. Each had shelves, jars labeled with formula names I recognized from Dad's world. Perchlorate, methyl tert butyl ether, nitrate assays. In the third shed, a lab centrifuge sat on the floor, larger than a microwave, sealed with what looked like epoxy poured around the lip. Dust covered everything, but the seal had kept rodents out. The sheriff had the deputy photograph the machine from every angle. "We'll have to bring these out carefully," Mason said. "Chain of custody, everything logged. I know you want to look, Marina." "I do," I said. I didn't trust my voice then. The name on the coat had split me open to hope, and hope, I'd learned, is a treacherous thing. That night, once the sun went down, I sat at my kitchen table with the laundry tag and the key photocopied by the sheriff and placed carefully in front of me. SE. My mind searched for meaning like fingers digging in sand. Southeast? Storage east? Or was it SE, as in standard error, a measure of uncertainty? I shut my eyes. Dad loved wordplay. When I was little, he hid notes for me in acrostics and leftover crossword squares. SE. He taught me the periodic table through songs. SE is selenium, number 34. But the tag had a 12. What locker opens with 12 and selenium? It was like he was with me at the table, leaning over my shoulder, not giving me the answer, but nudging me toward it. Our neighbor, a widow named Lydia Whitmore, stopped by with a casserole. I had told her what we found. Small towns don't keep news. And she hugged me with the fierce tenderness of someone who'd learned how to live with an empty side of the bed. "Storm pulled up more than trees," she said, setting the casserole down. "It pulled up some old fence wire beyond your back parcels. There's a footpath behind my line that heads southeast, I think. It dead ends at some sort of metal shed I always thought belonged to the old tree farm." Southeast. After she left, I called the sheriff. He told me not to go looking alone. The next day, a team pushed further southeast along the path Lydia mentioned. The woods opened into a small clearing, surrounded by young firs. At its center was a padlocked, low metal building. The sheriff ran his hand over the hasp. "Fresh," he said. "Not 17 years old." They cut the lock. Inside, the air colder than it should have been, we found nothing but rusted shelving. But at the back, someone had bolted a storage locker to the wall and painted over the number. The paint had peeled. The number underneath was 12. I took a step forward without meaning to, as if my body were a needle drawn to a magnet. The sheriff opened the locker carefully. Inside was a file box. The lid was duct taped shut, brittle with age. He let me hold it for a second before he took it back, saying again what he'd been repeating all day, gently but firmly. "Chain of custody." That box changed everything. They cataloged the sheds and brought out the equipment piece by piece. Because I was family, they let me observe from the edges, masked, gloved, pen and notebook in my pocket like I used to wear as a kid when Dad took me to take your daughter to work day. The box from locker 12 was opened in the presence of 2 detectives, the sheriff, and an evidence tech named James McKay, who looked young enough to still blush when he made eye contact. Inside were paper notebooks, wrapped in plastic, a stack of printed documents, and 3 microcassette tapes, tiny, clear rectangles I recognized from the voice recorder Dad kept on his desk. At the bottom, sealed in a plastic freezer bag, was a Polaroid picture I hadn't seen before. In it, Dad held up a piece of paper with a date, March 17th, 2009. That was 10 months after he vanished. When they unwrapped the notebooks, the room fell quiet. These were his field books, Dad's cramped block letters, the way he drew arrows when he ran out of space. He'd labeled them SE Trial on the spine. "What's SE?" the sheriff asked softly. I had been thinking of selenium, but in the first page of the first notebook, Dad had written SE, Southeast Plant, and then in parentheses, secondary effluent. I didn't understand, so I kept reading while the detective's camera clicked. Dad had been working with the Alder Creek Water Authority on a pilot project to remove industrial solvents from groundwater using a catalytic process at their Southeast plant, a smaller off-grid facility built decades ago. He mentioned perchlorate and MTBE, chemicals that make well water undrinkable. The notes were careful. He logged calibrations, control runs, drift checks. And as the pages turned into weeks and then months, the handwriting got shakier. About a third of the way in, a sentence appeared that punched through my ribs. "They need this to work or they lose everything. They say the test passes or I don't go home." In the margin, he'd written Klein and drawn a circle around it. "Who's Klein?" I asked the room. The detective looked at me and then at the sheriff. "We'll find out." While they ran background, I requested Dad's university records under FOIA. Most of what I got back were emails, cordial at first, then strained. There were mentions of the Southeast Plant collaboration and a private contractor named Mason Klein, who had been retained as a compliance consultant. Klein had a construction company that did a lot of business with the county and a reputation for knowing how to get projects over the line. In one email, Dad declined to sign a report that would allow the plant to restart. Data don't support the conclusion. Additional runs required. 2 days later was the date of the last email he ever sent. I printed everything and laid it out on my living room rug in order. Mom came over with a stack of scrapbooks and sat on the couch, her hands clenched, letting me read bits aloud. "He never walked away from us," she said once, mostly to herself. "He would never." The sheriff's office interviewed Klein, who still lived 3 towns over in a sprawling house with boat trailers stacked like trophies along the driveway. He denied ever seeing my father after a meeting at the water plant in 2008. He said the sheds weren't his. He could barely remember details, he said. So many projects, so many people. He smiled a lot, the kind of smile that let you know he assumed you were more naive than him. While they worked the legal channels, I kept going through the notebooks. Dad had a habit from when I was small. He used 3 dots to mark things he wanted me to find later. Ellipses, he'd explain, like, "The thought continues." In the second notebook, beside a sketch of a centrifuge rotor and a parts list, he'd drawn 3 dots. Rotor 8, balance key, another 3 dots. I called the evidence room. "The centrifuge," I said, trying to sound as professional as I could through a throat tight with hope. "Is it labeled? Does it have a rotor inside?" James, the young tech, said, "It's sealed so well we're not sure if the rotor's in there, but it rattles when we move it. We've been trying to figure out how to open it without compromising anything." "Dad used to hide things in rotors," I blurted. He said centrifuge is Latin for hiding in plain sight. Okay, maybe he didn't say that exactly, but he used to put the house spare key under the rotor lip. If he wrote balance key, I think he meant it literally. The key to balance the rotor's weight. And I think he hid something in there. By the time I arrived at the station, the sheriff and James had set up a clean table. He'd gotten permission for me to watch. They scored the epoxy carefully and pried the lid free. Inside was the rotor, heavy and matte black. James lifted it gently and set it on foam blocks. He unscrewed one of the 8 buckets, revealing a small cavity packed with cotton and a thin layer of wax. Under the wax lay a micro SD card sealed in a strip of heat-shrunk tubing, a note, and unbelievably, another tiny key, taped to the underside of the bucket with brittle electrical tape. The note was folded small. On the outside, in my father's hand, 3 dots. Inside, if they find this, they'll say I forged it. But the rotor keeps balance. The truth stays level. SE Locker 12, audio backup. He'd drawn another 3 dots and written 4M, for me. The micro SD card held 3 audio files. They were dated March and April 2009. The sheriff let me listen with them in a small room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. The first recording began mid-sentence. My father's voice, thin with fatigue. The numbers won't change because you want them to. We need different media or a longer residence time. A second voice, deeper, the vowels clipped in the way men cut their words when they're used to making deals. Sign the report, Dr. Hart. I won't, it's not true. A third voice, quieter, almost apologetic. One I learned belonged to a lab assistant named Victor Delgado, who had since moved out of state. They're saying if you don't, you won't see your family. I'm sorry, I didn't know it was like this. There was a scuffle, a scrape of chair legs. Then my father again, voice steady in that way he had at bedtime when the lights were off. If you hurt them, every tape, every copy goes to the state. If you let me finish, we might have something that works, but I won't falsify a thing. The second recording was mostly silence punctuated by the sibilant hum of the centrifuge. At minute 4, Dad whispered, as if to the machine itself, "For Marina, if you hear this, I did not leave you. I am trying to make the water safe because they won't wait. I am trying to come home." I cried so hard I couldn't see the waveform. The sheriff put a box of tissues on the table and stepped out to give me a minute. When I finished, I pressed both palms flat on the table and listened to the third file. It was made 2 weeks after the first. My father read a series of numbers, lab results, with date stamps that matched the notebooks. At the end, he said, "Klein wants a signature. The plant is not meeting the standard. If they open, people get sick. If I sign, I don't recognize myself." The recorder clicked off. With that, the sheriff's office obtained a warrant to search Klein's property. They found nothing obvious, no notebooks, no obvious connection to the sheds, but they did find ledgers showing payments from the Alder Creek Water Authority around the time of Dad's disappearance. The amounts were large. They also found a locked safe. It didn't hold a smoking gun, but it held 3 sets of keys tagged with faded paper labels. One said Essie, another said plant, one said shed. The district attorney's office brought in Klein for questioning again. He said the keys were from old jobs. He said the payments were legitimate consulting fees. He said he hadn't been anywhere near the state forest in years. Without an eyewitness or a recording of him making threats, it was swearing contest against a rich man with a good lawyer. That week, my mother pulled a plastic storage bin from the back of her closet and set it on my kitchen table. Inside were clippings and photos I'd seen before, and something I hadn't, a manila envelope she'd labeled E. Hart, S.E. Plant. She kept her jaw tight while she explained. "About a week after your father disappeared," she said, "I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The man told me to stop asking questions. He used your name, Marina, said you'd be safer if the paper said your father ran away. I saved the phone bill with the record of the call." She unfolded a copy of the bill and slid it to me. The call originated from a prepaid cell, but the timestamp mattered. It put pressure on the story that Dad simply walked out on a whim. People who run don't call home to threaten silence. People who cover up do. I took the bill to the sheriff. He got the DA to reopen the missing persons case as a kidnapping investigation. They put Victor, the former lab assistant whose voice we'd heard, on a plane. He sat with us in a conference room and looked at the Polaroid from 2009 for almost 5 minutes without speaking. When he finally did, his voice cracked. He asked me to help him send those tapes out if anything happened. I was a coward, he said. Klein made it clear there were people he could call at the county who'd make my life miserable. I did nothing. I'm sorry. Victor told us that the sheds were a field lab justified as a way to simulate well water conditions. In practice, he said, they kept Dad away from the university and from curious eyes. He said Klein answered to the water authority but seemed to have more power than any contractor should. He said he had never, not once, seen Dad leave those woods without an escort after October 2008. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" I asked, not unkindly, but not softly either. He grimaced. "I thought he'd show up," he said. "I told myself he was hiding for his own reasons. It has haunted me every day." We pulled public records on the Alder Creek Water Authority. There had been pressure coming from the state to reopen the Southeast plant. There had been fines stacking up while the wells remained offline. And there had been a pilot study billed as the savior, an innovative catalyst housed in a portable system, cheaper than a full refit. The pilot study was Dad's. In one board meeting transcript, the chair said, "We just need this to clear the last hurdle." I recognized those words from my father's tapes. They need this to work or they lose everything. I drove out to the southeast plant myself. I know I shouldn't have, but the gate was chained loosely like no one had been there in months. The place smelled like wet metal and old algae, the way a pool smells in winter when the cover slips and leaves rot in the corner. I walked the perimeter, corroded tanks, weeds eating through cracked concrete, a sign bleached to ghost letters. On the back side, half hidden by brush, I found a small concrete pad with anchor bolts. A rectangle of bare soil inside the weeds suggested something had been there once, maybe the portable unit the documents mentioned. Nearby lay a chunk of epoxy with a clean edge that matched the epoxy we'd carved off the centrifuge. I took photos and sent them to the sheriff. He forwarded them to the DA. A week later, our old neighbor Lydia called. "The county's bringing heavy equipment into the forest," she said. "I thought you'd want to know." I did. I drove out and parked near the trailhead where, as a kid, I'd learned to recognize deer prints. Now there were tire tracks and orange flags. The sheriff waved me past the tape to stand under a tree, while the crew carefully dug in an area next to the sheds where the ground had sunk. I wanted to beg the earth not to show us what it had hidden. They found him 20 inches down, wrapped in plastic. There was no bullet hole. There were no marks of a beating beyond the ones time leaves. The medical examiner later said he likely died of a combination of hypothermia and chemical exposure. The winter of 2009 had been bitter. Alone in a thin-walled shed, breathing solvents, even a strong man's body could decide to lay down. I thought grief would hit me like it did when I was there the night he didn't come home. A knife, a howl. Instead, it felt like weather moving through bone, cold, relentless, then a stillness that barely allowed breath. My mother and I held hands at the edge of that clearing while men we'd never met zipped a body bag around the shape we had loved. We told the sheriff thank you because there are no words for that moment except the ones that try to make strangers part of your family. On the day they returned Dad to us, I sat alone with his notebooks. The last page of the last book wasn't notes, it was a letter. "M," he wrote. "You liked when I used letters, said it felt like math and love got married. M, if you're reading this, the numbers were never the problem. It was the story they wanted to tell with them. If I taught you anything, let it be this. When people ask you to pretend water is clean when it's not, say no, even when they say they'll make you regret it. I love you more than all the zeros at the end of any grant. Dad." I pressed the page to my face like a handkerchief and wept until the tears dried on the paper. You might think that once you have tapes and notebooks and a body, justice sails in with lights flashing. It doesn't. Justice is a slow barge. It doesn't dock unless there's a place to tie up. And sometimes the people who own the dock throw rocks at you. The Water Authority's lawyers said the pilot study was independent research. They said the sheds were work areas and not an imprisonment. They said my father had been free to leave at any time. They pointed to the lack of locks on the shed doors. They asked why, if he was so determined to leave, he didn't walk out. I wanted to scream because that's not how control works. You take a man's reputation, you threaten his family, you isolate him. You say he has to finish this one thing to make it right. You make him too ashamed to stumble into a police station and say he's been held because you've convinced everyone he just ran. Our sheriff stood up in a town meeting and said he believed my father had been kept there under duress. The DA convened a grand jury. They reviewed the tapes, the notebooks, the payments. They interviewed Victor, who to his credit kept saying, "I was there, he was not free." They looked at Klein's schedules, his receipts. One ledger entry read, "SE site, supplies, the week the Polaroid was taken." A hardware store employee remembered selling epoxy by the gallon to a man in a county maintenance jacket. The county couldn't find a record of that purchase on their books. The grand jury indicted Klein on charges of felony kidnapping and negligent homicide. He was arrested without spectacle and posted bail the same day. There were whisper campaigns in town again. Some people think anyone who builds a new soccer field must be a good man. Those whispers still sting, but I learned to let them go. The trial would be a year away, maybe more. In the meantime, the Water Authority quietly settled a class action with homeowners whose wells had been affected by MTBE years before. They did not admit wrongdoing. They rerouted funds to upgrade the plant, not with a magical catalyst, but with proven, slower tech. In a press release, they included a line about our community's loss. It read like words drafted by a lawyer. I wish I could tell you there was a single climactic scene where someone shouted, "You can't handle the truth." There wasn't. There were long days of meetings. There were nights where I wanted to throw the notebooks into the river because I couldn't bear to keep being the daughter who knew what it feels like to want impossible things. There were mornings when I'd wake before dawn, make coffee the way he liked it, and sit with the Polaroids lined up like a math problem I couldn't solve. There was therapy. There were walks with mom where we counted chipmunks because counting animals is easier than counting griefs. But there was also this. We cleared his name. The university amended his personnel record to say deceased, service, and good standing. They held a small ceremony where they named a scholarship for students who push back when results are inconvenient. I stood at the podium in a blue dress I bought for a job interview last year and read a piece of my father's letter. The numbers were never the problem. It was the story they wanted to tell with them. People cried openly, even the dean who'd once declined to meet with us. The sheriff asked me, privately, what I wanted most as restitution. I told him I wanted the truth to live in a place my neighbors couldn't ignore. He nodded. A month later, after the board voted, a simple sign went up on the trail to the sheds. Hartfield site, in memory of Dr. Evan Hart, 1967-2009, who believed that public water must be publicly true. It was the kind of sign hikers might run their fingers over as they pass, wondering, and then carry that wondering home. Mom asked me to speak at Dad's memorial. I tried to write something grand, but what came out was plain. I talked about the way he'd explain big concepts by making small ones matter, how we learned about pH by baking cookies, how I once dissolved a penny in vinegar and salt and spent the whole afternoon trying to put it back together. I told him he loved bad jokes. I told him he loved us. I told him I will never forgive the people who told a town he left us when he didn't, but that I will not let that unforgiveness rot me. People put their hands on my shoulders afterward like barn cats rubbing to say we're still here. When they gave me the Polaroids after the case files were copied, I took the one from the shed, the one where Dad's eyes are tired and stubborn, and had it framed. It sits on my mantle between the photo of my wedding and a ceramic fish my son made at daycare that looks more like a potato. Sometimes I catch my boy staring at the framed Polaroid, trying to figure out why that picture of a stranger makes his mother smile and cry in the same heartbeat. I tell him, that's your grandpa. He believed in telling the truth even when it cost him. He nods solemnly as a toddler can, and then asks for more crackers. A month ago, I got a letter forwarded from the DA's office. It was from Victor. He was in therapy, he said. He'd started volunteering to test private wells for migrants who couldn't afford lab fees. He attached a receipt showing a donation to the scholarship fund. I wish I had been braver then. He wrote, I am trying to be braver now. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I first spread the coat and looked at the sunlight crawling across the wood. I thought about all the ways this could have gone differently, if the storm had been weaker, if Lydia hadn't noticed the path, if James had pried open the rotor from the wrong side and shattered the drive, if the grand jury had decided the tapes were inconclusive, if every small kindness had not added up to a rescue. The morning after we buried Dad's ashes in the cemetery at the edge of town, the one with the 2 maples that arch over the drive, they finally released the lab coat from evidence. It was brittle from time, stained and stiff. I brought it home and draped it over a chair. The fabric was heavier than I remember from when I would tug on his sleeve and feel that crisp cotton against my cheek. In the left pocket, still sewn perfectly straight, was the name Dr. Evan Hart. I traced the letters the way I used to trace the grooves on my school desk and felt something I hadn't felt in 17 years. Not joy, not relief exactly, but relief's quieter cousin, a settling. I took the laundry tag and the tiny key and hung them on a hook in my kitchen. Once in a while, when I'm washing dishes and the afternoon light turns everything the color of tea, I hear his voice again, the one that sounded like a smile even when he was disappointed. You can't argue with data, kiddo. And I answer out loud, because my son is too young to be embarrassed by that, and because sometimes you have to say things to make them real. I say, I know, Dad, we didn't. We argued with the story and we won. There's a bench now, too, in front of the library. The town council agreed to install it after a little pressure from folks who'd watched this whole thing play out from their porches. The brass plaque reads, "Sit, read, ask for proof." I sit there some afternoons while my son picks at dandelions and mom checks out mysteries from the large print shelf. People come up and say they're sorry. I tell them thank you. Some say they always knew he didn't leave. Some say they're shocked. Some say nothing and just touch my arm like we share a secret language of grief. We do. I still dream about the sheds. In the dreams, they are not terrible. They are quiet. The light is soft and green. Dad is there, but he does not speak. He is bent over a notebook, writing carefully as if the paper could vanish if he presses too hard. He looks up and smiles at me. Not the old smile of puns, but a new one, tired and calm. I wake up with my heart pounding and then slow my breathing and remember. We found him. We found his truth. We brought him home. There are questions that remain. Who else knew? Who else looked away? Some people will never face consequences that feel fair. But this is what I hold. The man my father was did not dissolve under pressure. He crystallized. He left a lattice I can hold up to the light. Places for the rest of us to grow into. Structure teaching us how to keep shape. If you've ever done a science fair project where the crystals didn't grow the way the instruction promised, you know what I mean. Sometimes the solution is different, but the pattern still catches. Sometimes the experiment you start at 9 years old doesn't finish until you are 30. If you were me, if the world told you a story about someone you loved, a story that didn't fit, and then a storm knocked down 2 trees and a piece of truth snagged in a branch, what would you have done? Subscribe if you believe every truth eventually surfaces.